So thanks for joining Seminar 3 for Adventures in Infrastructure Design. It's been a pretty good turnout, it looks like. Brilliant. So that's more than I would have thought. I've got two excellent guests. I've got Yves and Rebecca, both VCDX's consultants in their field. And we're going to spend the next, hour and a half talking about all things about design and disaster recovery. So we've got, I think the last few presentations, last few seminars have been orientated around the VCDX, although we've all done one. I'd like to open it up a bit more generalised. So I know we've got people, I think Graham's waiting. Hope you don't mind me saying that. I think we've got a few people on the call who are actually waiting for their invites. But anyone else who's not actually doing the VCDX, but just looking for design architecture in general, thoughts and processes around it, I think that's the piece that we don't often see. We see vendors talking about best practices, and architects tend to cringe at the term best practice. I know I do. So let's get started. So if you want to give a quick intro over to you guys, I think we've got Rebecca first, because she's going to give an overview and deep diving into bits of BC, DR and OR, and she'll explain what that's all about. And then we've got a bit of an interactive discussion by Yves. And if there's any chance, if there's anything left over that they wouldn't have covered, I'll just chat about stuff and do one of my mind maps. And that's the plan, I think, for today. I think as much interaction as possible, I think the guys will agree with me. Tell me if you don't, but as much as we can get from the people and the audience makes it easier for everybody. So that'd be quite cool. So hopefully you can control your mics, I think. I've given control to everybody. So I'll pass over the presentation over to Rebecca. She can give an intro and make a start. So over to you, Rebecca.
Sure, thank you. All right, let me load up my slides really quickly. All right.
Better. There we go. That looks familiar.
All right, magic. All right, cool. So, Mark's drinking while we're like slaving over this presentation. Way to rub it in, Mark.
Thanks for that.
Yeah. For those of you who do not know me, as Paul mentioned, my name is Rebecca Fitzhugh. So I work at Rubrik. So I have now made a day job out of talking about BCDR and backups and all of these really interesting / extremely boring things, if that's what you're into. And here's all the ways that you can harass me on the internet. So to kind of start, I want to talk a little bit about the difference between business continuity, disaster recovery, and operational recovery. Right? Because we tend to just sort of throw all of these things under one label and call it like BCDR, or in some cases we just call it DR, right? So the idea of business continuity is that really business goes on as usual despite a failure. So you may have an entire data center go down, and theoretically nobody would notice. Right? Because you may be configured with active sites. You may be globally load balancing across those sites. You may have your tier 1 applications and all of their dependencies spread across, right? So that way, if a site goes down, you have a seamless failover and no one really notices, right? Or it's just a minor blip of like, why can't I see this page refresh and now it's magically loaded. Whereas when we think about disaster recovery, this is, potentially a disaster that's much larger in scope and impact. So think, potentially a hurricane, right, or a tsunami, depending on what part of the world you live in, or typhoon. And so in this case, this really implies sort of a failure of a data center, and then we have to recover. So this can be an automated recovery. This may be potentially manual, but this does have some steps that have to be taken in order for things to magically come up on the other side, right? And then when it comes to operational recovery, these are the things that we kind of deal with day to day, right? So this is sort of a routine failure of this PCI device failed, or this host failed, or the switch failed, or anything like that. That would effectively be kind of a rip and replace type scenario, right? So this is not really a full disaster, generally speaking, though depending on how you've architected your infrastructure, it really could be, right? If you have a single router, and that is main point of contention. That's potentially your single point of failure there. I shouldn't say potentially, it is a single point of failure there. And if that were to fail, then you are completely up shit creek without a paddle, right? Then that would fall more under disaster recovery, really than operational recovery. But generally speaking, that would be more of an OR type scenario. Now, the thing to kind of keep in mind here is your organization may have all three, right? Because they may only be planning for business continuity for only the tier one customer-facing applications, right? And then you may have a DR plan that's fully orchestrated and automated to fail over and bring up all of your tier 2, tier 3, tier 55, right, applications from that point. And then, of course, I would assume, but you know what they say about assumptions, that you have some sort of planning in place for operational recovery. For example, if this PCI device were to fail, I have some additional cards on the shelf I can rip and replace, right? Or if a host were to fail, here's the process, right? So these tend to fall into your standard operating procedures for your operational recovery. So we hear a lot about risks, and I hope that everyone has read Paul's blog post on risk and risk mitigation. This is something that I can personally say that Paul definitely, I won't use the word mentored, but hammered into my brain over and over again. Well, it's great. I'm glad you identified that risk. Now, how are you going to mitigate that? Right. So risk, I hate reading slides, but risk here is a function of the likelihood of a given threat acting upon a potential vulnerability. Right. So in this case, your threat may be potentially a hurricane coming into the Gulf of Mexico and knocking out all the power in Houston. Right. And the vulnerability is that all of your data centers are in the Houston area. Right. Something like that. So what is the resulting impact and what does that do to the organization? So that kind of starts getting into the idea of like a business impact analysis, which is something that ideally, again, in a perfect type world, we would all do. And this may be something that you contract out to a third party, or this may be something that that happens in-house, right? So with the business impact analysis, this is where you're assessing those threats and figuring out what is going to be potentially the most affecting towards that business. Is it going to be some kind of natural disaster, or is it going to be ransomware, or is it going to be some kind of malicious or accidental deletion of data, right? Or anything like that. Because at the end of the day, it's what is the impact that this event has on the business, also known as how much money does the business lose if this happens, right? The perfect example is always, the most recent example is British Airways, right? They were down for a period of time recently, and they lost over $100 million because of this outage. And I love just, I'm not I don't tend to comment on these things on Twitter. I just like to be the observer. And so one of my favorite tweets was just some guy that goes, "Where's your backup data center, bro?" Like to British Airways, right? Where is it? Why couldn't they fail over? What happened? There's obviously systemic issues with NBA that caused this outage to be so severe, right? Mine is just some random quote unquote contractor pulling the wrong power plug, right? So the reason I'm talking Paul says poor contractors because me, Paul, and Eve have all been those poor contractors who did potentially nothing wrong, and somebody's got to be the shit rolls downhill, right? So this all kind of plays into great. Now that I've determined what risks I have within my business and what potential disasters I could face, what is going to be an appropriate SLA, right? When this is our service level agreement. Now, this is an agreement. It's a contract. Now, this may be between your IT department and all of your internal business units within an organization and what I guarantee to them. Or this could be, like if I'm using, for example, any kind of service provider, be it public cloud or otherwise, what they're promising to me as a customer, okay? So here's the slide with a lot of text, right? So because SLAs are a lot of text, they're a contract. So they're typically two things, right? They are service elements and management elements. Those are the two main components. And service elements are determining what is your time window for each SLA, what is the responsibility for the customer, what is the responsibility for the provider, cost, Okay, specifically what is included as part of this SLA. So this SLA of 4 nines, this may apply only to tier 1 applications, right? Or what's excluded. This only includes production applications, and all test dev applications are excluded, right? And an important thing to consider here is whether or not your maintenance window is included or excluded from your SLA, right? So if anybody's ever dealt with a lawyer, legalese tends to be very important. So you want to ideally make sure that this is explicitly spelled out. The management element, this is how often do I need to update this SLA? Should we review this every year? And what is the standard of measurement? Okay, so is this going to be a yearly measurement, which is very, very common? Or is this going to be monthly, weekly, yearly, quarterly? How are we going to measure whether we're meeting this SLA or not? I mentioned that it's typically a yearly type agreement. However, I have had customers in the past where it's every week, right? So every week that SLA resets. And I briefly kind of referred to this idea of the nines, right? So I said 4 nines earlier. So this is a very common way to measure an SLA. So you may promise, as the IT department, 99% availability, which effectively translates to you can have over 3.5 days of downtime per year, maximum. Whereas on the flip side of that, if you go up to 5 nines, okay, this is no more than about 5 minutes of downtime per year, okay, unexpected downtime. So again, unexpected downtime, what does that include? That goes back to how this SLA has been written, okay? So generally speaking, you want to exclude like your maintenance windows, right? So 5.5 minutes, or a little bit less than 5.5 minutes of downtime. So when I start thinking about that, that's redundant everything, right? That's synchronous replication. That's potentially active sites. That's global load balancing. It's starting to sound very, very expensive in my brain, right? Whereas if we go, 3.5 days of downtime per year, no problem. That's going to be a little bit easier to achieve, right? In that case, you would be looking more of the DR type scenario rather than business continuity, right? So, by the way, did anybody tell you that with OR, DR, BC, it's just going to be an acronym hell? So if nobody told you that, I'm very sorry. So some terms that you may or may not be familiar with. RPO, this is your recovery point objective. This is effectively how much data can you lose in the event of disaster. RTO, this is your recovery time objective. This is how long does it take for systems to be recovered? Okay, and then you've got WRT, which is your recovery time. So this is once the system's been recovered, how long does it take to resume services, right? So it may be 0, maybe your WRT. But think of those applications that, hey, you may have recovered the virtual machine, you may have powered on the virtual machine, you may have started services, but then when you go to that web interface, so that UI, it says services are still starting, right? And it takes another 2, 3, 5, 25 minutes to, I'm like, what, reading all the comments, we're like, yep, very familiar with this. This may take another 5, 10 minutes or however long to actually resume the services, okay? So up above the top, you see MTD. This is maximum tolerable downtime. This is all simple math. I don't think anybody realized that they were going to be doing math today. So if you didn't, I'm not sorry. You're going to be doing math today. So RTO plus WRT equals MTD, okay? Now, why do I have this slide immediately after SLAs, right? So like Paul, like Eve, I mentor people for VCDX. And I'm actually participating, and I saw one of the participants in this session today for Virtual Design Master. I'm one of the judges this year. And one of the most common things I see is that mathematically, Paul, I already said 2 bad words, so I'm just going to keep letting them rip. So I'm sorry. You can bleep me whenever you edit the video. Mathematically, their shit doesn't add up, right? So they may have, if we go back a slide, an SLA of, say, 4 nines, which is 52.6 minutes per year, maximum downtime, and then they'll tell me that their RPO is 24 hours or 48 hours. You're immediately violating your SLA. Your data is older, right? That your data is now older than what you said was allowable according to your agreement that you legally signed and obligated yourself to adhere to. Same thing with RTOs, right? I see the same thing where they might go, yeah, okay, my RTO is 1 hour. Well, 1 hour is still violating a 52-minute maximum, right? So think of this to use vSphere terms. This is your slot size right here, right? This is your maximum allowable downtime. These should fit, these little bits and pieces should fit within that slot, okay? So if your SLA, remember, you can be as specific with your SLA as you need to. So like, for example, my VCDX SLA for my design was reset every single week. And that was real world. It was reset every single week. So effectively every 5 days, because the weekends were all maintenance windows. Like, Paul's just trolling me now. I'm like watching on this chat. So every 5 days, right, Monday through Friday, we had to adhere to whatever the SLA was. Saturday, Sunday was like effectively a maintenance window every single week. This was an education client. And then reset, and the SLA was measured anew starting Monday morning, right? So it's very, very important to be as explicit as possible with that SLA, because when you start factoring in your RTOs, your RPOs, that can get very, very tricky, right? Because it all boils down to mathematically, does it make sense? Are you violating that SLA, yes or no? So again, like reading designs, whenever people mention design qualities, the two things that I see always grouped together inevitably is availability and recoverability. And they are sisters, right, or they're brothers, or they're cousins, or whatever you want to call them, but they're not exactly the same, right? So availability is, if something were to fail, I should have no impact, right? So again, like active sites, we're looking at application level load balancing, or clustering. We're looking at redundancy at the physical layer. Something should fail, I should have no impact. Recoverability is, okay, something fails. Now, how do I recover from it? Is it recoverable? Okay, so this is where, okay, great, my site is now down. I need to recover in a secondary site, right? So that becomes more of a DR thing. I need to recover from backup. I need to rip and replace. I need to do all of these things to now, because this component has failed, my services are suffering because of this failure. We need to fix it, right? Where it was availability, there should be no impact. It's highly available. So I use this cartoon a lot, and I think probably even Paul and probably many of you in the audience can agree that when it comes to working with clients, we start talking about disaster recovery. This is effectively what the DR plan always is.
What's wrong with that approach?
It's perfect.
Yeah,
there's no problem with it.
Yeah.
Yep.
As long as I've got a book that tells me what to do in every order, I'm okay. On paper, I'm fine.
Yeah. Well, you know, and my favorite thing that I always hear from company or from people who work for big consulting firms is always, well, they didn't buy the DR add-on package. They didn't buy those services.
Or the classic one, recovery is only included in the Platinum Edition.
That's it.
Yeah. Exactly. You didn't pay for those services. We can't help you with DR. You know, and so for some of you, you may kind of fall into that mentality, right? And that, you know, it is what it is. But like for me personally, that's never really been an option a lot of the time. Because if for those of you who don't know me, I'm originally from New Orleans. New Orleans has never had any kind of natural disaster ever happen, right? It's a city that is effectively shaped like a bowl and surrounded by water on all sides, right? It's just like a disaster waiting to happen. And then I also lived in Japan for 2 years. And, you know, we get hit every summer because I was in very South Pacific Japan, hit every summer by different typhoons, right? So DR was always a big thing. You know, I was living in Japan during the tsunami that hit the Miyagi Prefecture, right? So DR tends to be a big recurring theme, whether I want it to be in my career. And so this has always been kind of something that I've been very interested in. So what do we need to consider? Right? And this is not an all-inclusive list. This is just me making things up yesterday because I scheduled an hour to build this presentation. So, of course, when it comes to VCDR and operational recovery, you know, you've got things built into vSphere, right? You have HA, host fails, we can bring those virtual machines up, and we know that HA has gotten much smarter in vSphere 6 with the ability to detect things like an APD and a PDL, right? You've got fault tolerance, which I know everybody uses, right? It's awesome. Up to 4 vCPUs, you guys. It's the best. You, of course, have like application load balancing, right? Backups. Are they going to be application consistent? Are they going to be full backups, incremental forever, differential? How often are you going to be backing up your virtual machines? Are you going to be storing them where, right? Are you going to be replicating those backups somewhere? Are you going to be archiving them? Are you going to archive to tape? Are you going to archive to public cloud? What is your plan, right? So backups, of course, are a big piece, but they are not the only thing. What happens if your site fails? Do you have active sites, right? Are you using SRM? Are you using stretch clusters, right? What does your runbook look like? Is it manual? Is it automated? You, of course, have replication factoring in with site failure, okay? And in your replication also can fit into your runbook, right? So is it going to be synchronous or is it going to be asynchronous? And this is going to follow a lot of times your RPO. Now, I already mentioned that one of the big things that I see a lot is that RPOs and RTOs tend to be configured to violate SLAs, right? I mentioned that was a problem that I see a lot. And the other thing that I see a lot too, or here, I should say here a lot, is I'll go, hey, where's your RPO? What is your RPO? And then the number one response I get back if I don't see it or it's not written or it's not documented somewhere is something like this. Well, my customer didn't give me an RPO. What? I mean, I very rarely walk into a client site and they go, yeah, here's my RPO, here's my RTO, here's my MTD, here's my SLA, right? These are pieces of information that we have, or yeah, Paul said it's out of scope. These are pieces of information that as an architect, you are responsible for pulling from your client, right, from that customer. And you might not be able to walk in and say, what's your RPO? They might go, I don't know what the hell that means. And then you have to explain it to them, right? How much, if an event were to happen, how much data could you potentially lose, right? And then, of course, they're always going to say we can afford to lose no data. And then you explain to them the cost. Yep, Paul says 0%. And you explain to them the cost associated with that. And then they start changing their tune. Now, here's the thing is they may not still explicitly give you a specific amount of time for RTOs and RPOs. They may give you very generic type things. It is up to you then to make a design decision and say what the RPO and RTO is, right? Because think about it like this. I need to configure replication. Say I'm using vSphere replication. We know it's asynchronous. I need to determine what that RPO is going to be and how often I need to replicate. Do I just say, oh, well, screw it. My client didn't tell me what the RPO is? Or do I make an executive decision and say, here's what the RPO is. I'm going to replicate every 1 hour because the SLA is X, Y, and Z, right? What is the risk associated with that RPO? Okay, make a decision. Right? And then, of course, go for it.
Sometimes it's come and just say, okay, we don't have all these numbers. It sometimes really helps to go into the extremes. One of the scenarios I do a lot then is like, okay, if I take your complete IT offline for the next 6 months, would that be acceptable? And then you immediately get a reaction. It's like, no, that's absolutely not acceptable. And that says, okay, so in your mind, you have already parts of your SLA. We just need to actually now figure out where exactly between 0 seconds and 6 months your SLA actually sits. And sometimes pulling out extreme numbers actually helps getting people back on their feet. It's like they have something in their mind, but they have never actually really thought it through.
Absolutely, right. And then a lot of times you just going out there and saying, well, what's the RPO? That terminology may mean nothing to them, right? So it is absolutely like what Eve said, where you really may need to walk them through a few different scenarios. Is this okay with you? No? Okay, well, what about this? Is this okay with you? Right, to really determine what these should be set at, right? And of course, the most important thing here really is test and validate. Do you know what the number one cause of outages is? I'm like not making up the statistic. This is a real statistic. Do you guys know what the number one cause of an outage is? User error. we're the number one cause of outages. Yeah, Paul got it right. So you can have, you know, the greatest plan in the world, okay? But yeah, ask BA. Nice, Mark. Throwback. So you can have the greatest plan in the world, and there's always going to be something that's going to screw it all up for you, right? And that's why all of this really goes back to that business impact analysis, right? So at the very, very beginning of this process of you building out a DR plan, what is the most likely things that you're going to experience, right? If you are, you know, in Germany, you're probably not going to go, yeah, typhoon's the most likely thing. Yeah, probably not, right? So user error, power issues, right? Data corruption, malicious, right? Intent, things like that. Okay, and then of course that all gets balanced with what is your price point. I know I work for a backup company. I'm sorry, cloud data management company. I'm supposed to say the thing that they want me to say, right? But like I've been kind of building to it. Backup does not equal disaster recovery. Great. I'm so glad that you backed up your VMs and now your entire site's down. What are you going to do? Right. So this is a piece of your DR plan. You have the backups, you have the data. Now, how do you recover from that? Is that going to be automated? Is that going to be manual? Do you have that data replicated somewhere else? Are all of your backups stored in the same site as the site that's down? Right. So there's a lot to think of. Okay. So kind of tying this all together at the end, it's really important for you to talk to the right people, to understand your business processes, and to establish that business impact analysis, okay, to determine what are the most likely events that are going to happen and which ones are going to result in the business losing the most amount of money. Because at the end of the day, if the business isn't making money, I'm not going to get a check, right? So that's what I care about. Look at your existing IT infrastructure. You're probably not doing this for a brand new greenfield data center. If you are, awesome, right? But likely you already have infrastructure there. So you need to start looking at and identifying risks, single points of failures, right? Gaps in knowledge, gaps in technology. Are you 15 versions behind on whatever, okay, on whatever application? And start trying to understand how it all maps and pieces together. And then you need to start working through those different scenarios that have been established in the business impact analysis and figuring out what are going to be the correct strategies to recover from these scenarios that meet the requirements of the SLA, right? And if you're getting like your SLA something like 5 nines or even higher, then it's not going to be recover from. It's going to be this scenario should happen and my business should be not impacted at all, right? And then, of course, figuring out what your current recovery capabilities are, establishing new ones, and documenting. I know that's everybody's favorite thing, but documenting, right? And building out run books, things like that. But at the end of the day, you need to take a very holistic view of the framework for DR and figure out what's going to be appropriate. Is it going to be business continuity or DR or both, right? And so on. And the name popped up very, very quickly. I think it was Victor. He said something along the lines of keep it simple, stupid, right? The KISS principle. And I agree, right? If you can do all of the things you need to do with one or two tools, do it with one or two tools, right? Why would you have one tool for this application, another tool for this application, or a completely different tool to back up physical servers and a totally different tool to protect your virtual machines? That's going to be very, very complicated, right? Because think about it. Like if I use my experience, growing up in the Deep South, it is a hurricane is coming into the Gulf of Mexico. It's going to hit New Orleans in 48 hours. I need to now bring down the site in New Orleans and bring up the site somewhere else. If I have 50 different tools that are protecting 50 different things in 50 different ways, what's the likelihood that I'm going to be able to successfully fail over from A to B, right? So definitely keep it as simple as possible. So kind of a quick example, right? I call this a BCDR plan. Why? Okay, because when it comes to business continuity, we're really only protecting the tier 1 application in a continuous manner, right? Because I have my web servers balanced across 2 different sites, right? I'm using global load balancing, global DNS. I've got the application, right? And I've got the database actually across 3 different sites. I have a 3rd site for witness and quorum, okay? So with this specific application, with the Tier 1 app, I should be able to lose Site 1 and Site 2 pick up seamlessly, right? But that's only one application, and this may be my most important app that all the users are accessing from the outside world. Great. But then for everything else, right, all my Tier 2, Tier 3, and so on applications and my test dev type stuff, that may all be failing over using some kind of DR automation tool, right? This could be Site Recovery Manager, and it's going to be using some kind of scripting to then bring them up in Site 2 after Site 1 is lost, or vice versa, right? So this combination of both here. So if my 4.9's SLA is only applying to my Tier 1 application, and I'm mentioning that I'm doing application consistent backups every 10 minutes, right? Database consistent backups every 10 minutes, and I'm retaining them for a period of 30 days. I'm really, for my business impact analysis, trying to protect myself against a single point of failure at the software hardware layer, a single site failure, deletion of data, and I'm replicating. You know, I have an RPO of 15 minutes. I have an RTO of 25 minutes. My work recovery time is 5, so 25 plus 5 equals 30. All of that fits well within my SLA of 52 minutes, maximum downtime in a year, right, with 4.9s. Okay. Is it perfect? No, this is just something I whipped up on a plane a couple of weeks ago, right, to kind of give you an idea. So this is just simply the Tier 1 apps being protected automatically in terms of global load balancing, and then everything else would have to fail over with the DR tool, right, which still can be automated. So that's kind of all I have, because what's going to happen now is I don't want to spoil it, but I think we're going to have a little bit of a test of your knowledge. All right, so does anybody have any questions over anything that I covered so far? All right. No, I don't get any love for this, like, perfect Arrested Development picture here. Oh, man. All right, let me stop sharing my screen. And I will go through all the comments. I didn't catch them all as they were going, so if there's any questions I missed, I will respond to you. All right.
Cool, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. That was great. So that's pretty much covered everything. So the seminar's over. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much. No, that was really good. I think if you're doing the VCDX, I think, although it wasn't aimed at VCDX, but if you'd had that before I was taking it, it does summarise everything pretty well. I think when I was in the room, they'd be asking these questions. And I think even now at the moment, I'm going through a plan where I'm doing something very similar. People are putting in new technology, and we've got one person from each silo in a TDA type design workshop every week, and we critique each other. And one of the things that me and one other guy is saying, well, how do you back this up? How do you recover it? How do you operationalize it? You know, the best, most complicated system in the world, but then how do we bring it back? So I think there's some good thoughts there. Cool. Thank you very much for that. And I've been tweeting a few of these slides there. There were some really good ones. I think the scary nines looked good, and that drawing about the flow was quite good as well. That's cool. Over to you, Yves, I think. Are you around?
Yes, I'm here. Can you pass me the presenter?
I will do. I'll pass you that over now, mate. There you go. Thank you very much for doing this. Appreciate it. I know you're quite busy.
So, here's what we are going to do next. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint. I guess I have to do it this way as well. So the idea is I surely can't take any of our customer scenarios, but the idea is now, and I would love if the audience can actually jump in here and there and actually come up with their own scenarios. But if not, I'm just going to walk everyone through this. This is basically, so the story is going to be about a real life use case, and it's pretty similar to one of the scenarios Rebecca was referring to before. I wanted to go over some BCDR scenarios for an actual design. So before I start, who am I? Yves Sanford. I started to found the ComDivision group in '96. I did my VCDX, I think it's now already 2 years ago or something like that. It's interesting how fast the time goes. You can find me on Twitter if you want to. From time to time, if I have the time, I try to put something on the ComDivision YouTube channel. It's a bit dated at the moment, but I have quite a few stuff on the agenda. I also did some video-based trainings for pack publishing on NSX and VRA. And yeah, my daily job over the last 2 years has changed quite a bit. I'm actually, besides being an instructor, I'm also running around as a cloud evangelist and an architect. And that's more the representing role on the one hand side. On the other side, I'm working as a business advisor for service providers. And the good part of that is I'm actually there to grill their SLAs and to analyze, especially the SLAs, not only from a business continuity perspective, but from a lot of other areas as well, and trying to find holes in their strategies and in their plans, especially for public service providers. And a lot of the points Rebecca actually pointed out to are actually very common, and even with managed service providers and cloud providers, sometimes you would be surprised that not much more actually happens even with the big ones out there in the field. So how about the scenario we are going to talk about? The scenario we are going to talk about is a demo and lab environment. And that is a pretty common scenario where people go, it's like, oh, that's easy. It's a demo and lab environment. So if it breaks, it doesn't matter. It's actually, and Rebecca can talk to that as well, it's actually also one of the most challenging environments because it never forgives. When you in your home lab actually break something, okay, that's fine. If you imagine that you have students sitting globally in classrooms, maybe multiple hundreds of them, then it becomes a completely different story. That's in a classroom. We even do this for exhibitions and trade shows from time to time. If you imagine that you have a product launch ahead of a trade show, you only have 3 days of a training, then in that scenario, you cannot just actually go away and say, it's like, yeah, we have an SLA, and if it breaks, it can take a couple of hours to come back. That's just not an option. And so that is what we are going to look at. So just to give everybody a bit of an overview of what sits behind, and most of you must have attended a VMware class or something else before. And there is actually quite a lot going on in the background. So when you look at a normal classroom, you have an instructor, you have students. All of them have somehow devices which access an environment. And in our scenario, we are going to expect that they access the demo environment we run. And so that's going to be the scenario we have to deal with for the next couple of minutes, is how would we solve a scenario like that? And I will come up actually with quite a few workflows, and that covers back a lot of the scenarios Rebecca was talking through. So the idea here is we have that scenario, classroom needs to access a cloud lab kit, and that's a demo and lab environment. And when we look at that, this is just an excerpt of an internal documents we had to initially build this. And as you can see here, this is just an excerpt out of some of the requirements we have. And the most important one is actually the availability, what we are going to look at for this scenario. And so what it says here, the system is required to provide 2 service levels for customer lab operations and for development and test. And you can see here already that we point out availabilities, RPOs, RTOs, and the first thing which pops into everybody's visibility here is that we have an RTO of 90 minutes versus 2 days. And that's the first one which should actually surprise you of what that actually means in detail. And I'm going to quickly look over a problem flow, and that is something which I do very commonly with partners and customers. Is really, it's not all about just defining an SLA and just defining the individual numbers in, okay, 99.9% availability. But the question is always, where do we start with these SLAs? And so if we look at this flow chart here, there is a problem showing up in this scenario or in this environment. So the first question to ask is, okay, is this an individual lab kit failure? And in this case, or is it more a technical issue of the instructor? And in this case, that's where we start from a timing perspective. And we can say, yes, okay, it's a lab kit failure, so we need to maybe redeploy that. Is that redeployment possible would be another question. Yes, no, depending on what's going on out of that. So But the important point is first of all, you need to define when your SLA time actually starts. And that's something where you get a lot of different answers in most enterprises. Is for some, just by the fact that they raise a ticket, the SLA timer starts already to tick until when the application needs to be back up. However, I also heard a lot of people come back and say, oh no, it depends on if we declare that it's really a failure. So that is something where we can use this flowchart easily, because it says, okay, problem comes in, we first go through some standard scenarios to identify how we would classify it. So in this scenario, LabKit failure. Another scenario could be, is there a software or management component failure, yes or no? And so you can see here how are we actually looking at the scenario. Are other kits affected by this? So that could be in a normal enterprise. Are other applications affected by it? Are other sites affected by it? And you can also see here from the first yellow box, maintain ticket and evaluate, prepare for execution of disaster recovery. So one of the important parts in this whole plan is there is actually the point where someone needs to declare a disaster, which is something which is also very commonly missing in most enterprises, that someone actually has to take the decision, it's a disaster, we are now actually opening up the books for the disaster recovery. In some enterprises, that really looks, and I have been at some Fortune 500 companies, and they actually have sealed envelopes and stuff like that, which is it looks more like they are preparing war or something. But in some cases, that means that includes all cell phones and everything, cell phone numbers of the complete C-level, because you need to take a decision. A good relative of mine actually works for a car manufacturer in Germany, and they have the same case. In case of a major IT outage, they have a complete call list. And they need to find two executives who would actually take the decision, we are going to fail over from the primary to the secondary data center, because we know that means a couple of hours interruption in our production. So that is something where people need to think about these scenarios, and people need to understand that that's part of an SLA. I'm also quite often surprised where you see people in enterprises where they tell you it's like, why am I, as a CEO, CFO, or something like that, involved in the disaster recovery plan? The point is, if we look at the BA scenario, which Rebecca actually pointed out perfectly, maybe one of the scenarios what went wrong in their plan is that they couldn't find someone to take certain decisions until the whole problem actually escalated quickly. And those are scenarios we need to always think about. So that is something you need to have, whether it's a problem flow chart or something else. So this is just one piece out of an operational procedure, which I wanted to share, but this is actually helping you. And this is also for those people who are aiming for VCDX defenses. It's actually, when I'm mentoring, I see a lot of people creating tons of text slides. Sometimes workflow charts like this make your life a lot easier to explain things. And there is a smaller risk that you point out immediately some textual issues in your overall design. So it's always a good idea to have those types of workflows, and the feedback I got also from candidates who went down that path actually was quite helpful for them to work down with these types of scenarios as well.
I think that's why I had the same Yves. I think on my successful defense, I had something very similar to that. And it was up for pretty much 50% of my defense. They kept going back to it. They wanted to crack that. It really did centralize the questions. I think it scores a lot of points if you need it. I think it's good.
It comes back to whether you can explain your SLA, and that's a lot of the discussions for successful enterprise architects, etc. Is not only whether you know all the technical details of your applications. It's in many cases it comes back to these scenarios. Do you understand the business needs? One of the very common scenarios, what I see a lot with enterprises, is you come into a room where there should be an enterprise architecture discussion, and you have already 5 vendors sitting at the table and presenting their applications and their solutions, where very often I have to move the whole discussion back 5 levels. It's like, what is the business requirement? And everybody comes up with solutions for something in the first place, whereas they don't even know what the business requirement is in the first place. And that's something which is important to come back. And such flowcharts, or the way you do it with mind maps, are a very good helping tool to refocus people back to the important pieces. Plus, I have seen a lot of customers taking these flowcharts and actually putting them in a binder so that in case of a disaster, they can actually pull them out. And such a flowchart in a disaster scenario is very often easier to read than a 500-page documentation where you have to jump between pages all the time. Good. Okay. Let me skip over these a bit. So how did we solve all that in this specific scenario? And I included a few pieces here just for those people who are working on something like for their VCDXs, is how a conceptual design should look like, or could look like, not should look like, because everybody has their own type of drawing, etc. on it. The important piece, what I always see when I have to talk with people about conceptual designs, at this level, it actually, it shouldn't be product focused. It's about different components you are going to use, and that's also in this scenario, what's going to be affected by availability, disaster recovery, etc. And you can see on the left-hand side, all of that is actually spanning all the different layers, which is something which a lot of people tend to forget. It's not only about that you need to solve the DR piece for your infrastructure. There's a lot of services you need to manage on top of that, and it might also affect other scenarios. So all of that needs to be covered. From a process discussion, this is not about the business continuity, but this is actually just another example where SLAs are affected, because one of the other SLA we had in the beginning was about how much time the deployment is allowed to take, etc. And again, you can see here that this graph actually has different points in there where the SLA timer starts and stops, which is important for a lot of companies, because very often people envision that maintenance windows are out of scope for SLA. But on the other side, when you look through the printed documentations, you very often find that it's nowhere even mentioned. It's just because it's clear that during a maintenance window, your SLA doesn't count. But that's also coming back to the legal point, which Rebecca made as well, is if legally it's not nowhere in the document, that means your SLA is going to run 724, 365 days a year. And so that's why it's important to mention these windows and to also figure out where to actually place them and make it clear for everyone, because that's a common scenario. It's one of the good reasons why you get so many companies actually come in and tell you, oh, we don't have an SLA, we don't need one, is very often it's not only because they don't want one. In many cases, it's because if they were to start writing down what the real life SLA would be, they would actually get into serious issues. They would actually get into serious issues with their management. It's one of the other scenarios I see very often when I have to write not full designs or architectures, but actually write up summaries of a lot of things, where I get very often papers back. It's like, could you remove the last 5 risks out of there? And I go like, why? Because, and you see very often that people, it's like, yeah, our management is well aware of that issue, but we don't want to see it somewhere in writing, which is showing also a very good scenario. And Victor points out, seeing the decision time too, that's another scenario, another point is, how long does it take to take the decision that you have to declare a disaster? One of the designs I reviewed lately was where someone told me it's like, yeah, we have a contract where it says it's going to be 4 hours to replace a complete blade chassis. Where I said, it's like, okay, first off, you cannot actually build your SLA based on that, because the first problem is until you get someone at the vendor on the phone to agree that they have to start the 4-hour counter, that's already an issue. Even if they are going to start the 4-hour counter, I really would love to see vendor A, B, or C being able to bring a complete new blade chassis, rack it up in your data center, recable it, and get it up and running within 4 hours. And then the response was, but they gave us that in writing, which is like, that writing doesn't help you anything if you are violating your SLA. And I would even argue from an insurance perspective, or if I were to review such a design afterwards, in case they would have had a disaster, I would argue everybody should have been very clear that this is nowhere near achievable. It doesn't help you if a vendor tells you I can be back up and running with a complete blade chassis in 4 hours, if you know already that it's no way possible. They need to bring it, unpack it, and all that kind of stuff. And I think we all know how that life actually goes. So let's take a different look at disaster recovery, because one of the things in this specific scenario, and that actually is something which took us quite a bit from a design discussion, is, and that comes back to Rebecca's story before as well, is how do you deal with the primary and backup co-location if your backup co-location doesn't have all the services? One of the solutions, like pointed here, could be that you have a contract with your with a DR site where you can rent compute resources, storage resources, or network resources, and you have a great time level with them on how quick they can actually provide that. The question with all of that is always did you ever test that? Did you validate that it's possible to provide that in that point in time? Because very often these co-location vendors promise everything, and then when you look at it, it's a different story. Like Rebecca said, it's like, okay, New Orleans is a perfect example for natural disaster shouldn't strike that city. I could tell us a completely similar story from our own data center. About 2 or 3 years ago, Münster, where our main data center is actually located, in that scenario, Münster doesn't have a real river. We don't have any oceans or seas or anything else around us which actually provide water or anything else. There is no real severe thunderstorms or anything which normally break into the city. So normally there is basically, except something really bad, but normally there is nothing where a natural disaster could ever hit the city. And that is why we actually have 2 major bank data centers for complete of Germany in Münster. And a lot of other larger data centers are there as well. It's not the common place like Frankfurt in Germany, but it also has some larger data center facilities. And then 2 or 3 years ago, we had major rain issues, and that rain issue was we had within, I think, 1 or 2 hours a few hundred liters per square meter of rain, and the complete city was basically washed out with water. And that was a major issue for a lot of companies, because it was not only a disaster for their primary sites. In one case, one of the banks actually, they had to go back and recover everything from tape, because both of their data centers were completely flooded, and the reason for both of these data centers were flooded is one of them was actually directly beside one river, which is normally more a small one, and the other one was actually also underground. So they had 2 underground data centers in a city where nowhere there is any water damage expected, but they were actually heavily hit by that at one point in time, and that was where they actually said, it's like, okay, we are going to fail over to our co-location site. And all of a sudden, a lot of the companies in Münster figured out that all of their co-location sites were down as well, because the complete area in the surrounding of, I think, 50 kilometers was affected by that issue. And besides a few smaller data centers, a lot of them were actually, everybody was flooded. And that is something you need to take into consideration for your backup co-location as well, is if there is a natural disaster, how unexpected it can be in any scenario is, would you be affected by it? And that's another scenario when you talk also about, when I talk to service providers, a lot of managed service providers come up very often and say, it's like, oh, the first service we are going to offer to our customers is business continuity disaster recovery services. And I said, it's like, okay, are you prepared that all your customers could come at the same day and expect services from you? And that is a perfect scenario how things can go completely wrong. And that's something where you need to test co-location services as well. Another one which I wanted to quickly point out here from a scenario before we open up maybe for additional questions is this is actually just a little plan pointed out for the same scenario on how a disaster recovery process could look like. And so first of all, it starts up with a similar scenario. Has a disaster been declared? And that's a very important question. It's underestimated in a lot of DR scenarios, and that can actually lead to larger issues. Is if people start to ramp up a disaster recovery plan without being very, very clear that you are running a disaster recovery initiative. Because in many companies and in many larger data center environments, declaring a disaster and running through the runbooks means in many cases, it's nothing which you can quickly revert from. It's causing major outages. And it also means in many cases that we are going to rip out certain active scenarios, etc. So it's always important to bring back to people's mind. It's like, has someone with the authority really declared the disaster? Can we really start running down this process? And then it starts with something, and as we point out here, start out with something very, very simple. Start out with something like issue an all hands call. Is there a procedure how we get everybody on board? And then are there parallel process streams which run, like you can see here, we have 3 parallel process streams for that specific scenario, and then they actually reconnect at certain points. There are validation procedures in there, and only if everything has been declared valid, then the disaster can also be revoked and everything can be returned back to normal. But again, those are scenarios, and these types of workflows have been proven that we can actually do that a bit easier in real life. Okay, with that said, I have covered most of my stuff. So I hope I gave a few good ideas on how you could solve this in real life. Any questions from that perspective from anyone?
Yeah, thanks very much, Yves. What's the so you've been doing a lot of mentoring recently. What's the best tip you can give to people who's doing the VCDX who are currently on the call? I know I can see at least 4 or 5 people about to get their invites. So from someone who's done it, what would you say from a DR perspective?
When I look at mentoring candidates, first of all, at least what I can say about myself is I'm doing a miserable job of giving an idea of whether the persons I have in front of me are going to fail or pass. I had too many issues in both directions where I said this is a clear go, and it actually ran down the different paths and the other way around. What I heard back from a lot of people is it's really important that you listen to whoever you have from a mentoring perspective. All of us who are doing the mentoring part, I think, is we are not there to harm you or to actually make you feel bad. The point is, the more we actually, the more we help you polish your presentation styles before the actual defense, the more or the better your chance to survive. And take the feedback serious. And it is something. I had the wonderful experience. I actually did my design together with a colleague, and that helped us all a lot because we challenged ourselves throughout the complete design scenario. So whenever someone took a design decision, the other one looked at it, it's like, okay, so I have 5 other ideas on how that could be solved. So find really counterparts. And one of the scenarios which I tell a lot of my candidates as well is find more business people to actually review your papers as well, not the papers, but the presentation. A lot of people, what I have seen in the mentoring part, a lot of people actually tend to go always back to their tech counterparts. And the tech counterparts, I think that's great and that's valid, but also get feedback from the non-tech people on your presentation as well. Would a business person understand what you are presenting? Because in the end, in reality, per definition, in the VCDX, or not only the VCDX program, we could take other vendor programs, they are all very similar at that level, is the panelist's role is actually to play a customer side. And when they play the customer side, we need to be, it needs to be understandable from a business perspective. And I have been through 2 defenses on my VCDX story. And one of the problems I had in the first time is actually I couldn't really explain, at least in certain areas, what the business problem was I was to solve. And so that's why advice from business people can help is, can you explain the real use case you're trying to solve with non-technical terms? And the other part is, and I think this session was, and the previous sessions which Paul put together are important for that. SLA, business continuity, disaster recovery, as Rebecca mentioned, is know your numbers and know that it's really feasible to achieve that. As I just said, 4 hours for a complete blade enclosure change, including raising the ticket. That's interesting. I really want to see how that works in real life. Those are numbers which can actually bring you into long discussions.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Yves. I appreciate it. And thank you very much for taking the time to put that together. I know you're busy at the moment, so I appreciate taking the time out.
Yeah. I think it's good if we have these types of sessions. It helps people also the different levels or the different types of how presentations can be done. Because what I hear a lot from my mentoring candidates is always what is expected, and what I see, and I guess you can agree on that as well, is the different levels and approaches you see when you are mentoring candidates on the VCDX approach. Is I cannot tell you if your design requires 120 pages or 900 pages. I have seen all of that. I have seen everything in between 100 pages and 900 pages. And none of that is a guarantee for failure or a guarantee for success. The same for presentations. I have seen people who just had a black and white presentations and were perfectly fine with that. And I had people with highly styled presentations. Again, the question is it your presentation? Do you know what's in there? I actually had candidates where it was very obvious that they haven't seen or touched their presentations for the last 6 months, and now they are short ahead of the defense, and they do their first workshop and their first review with a mentor, and they actually stumble through their slides, and that's to the point where we can say it's like, that gives us a bit of a bad feeling now. But again, that's the point, is know your stuff.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's what it is. I think that's I think for me these sessions help me a lot because it keeps you sharp, it keeps the thought process going over and over and over every time. And I find that in the real world it really does help.
And that's I think one of the important points always is don't get too tech focused. What I see a lot, and I'm not sure if you see similar things, but what I see a lot is people tend to have the feeling that they need to go through every advanced setting in their defense.
It is, yeah.
And that's why I keep saying to people, it's like, find people outside of the standard VMware tech field and find other people who are going to review your presentation and who are going to go through your defense. I had the wonderful scenario. I actually had multiple product managers from VMware actually grilling me on before my defense on a specific product feature set. That was because I knew these people and they were happy to help, and that was not an unfair advantage because mostly everyone could have reached out to them because they were more than happy to help there. It's like sometimes people are so focused, it's like I need someone out of the VMware field to review my stuff, and that's not always the solution to everything.
Yeah, I definitely agree on that. I think the last round of VCDXs that came out, there was one guy in particular, I won't mention his name, but he was successful, he did very well, but I think he name dropped continuously saying Dell, 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 and these advanced features. And in one of the mentoring sessions, I said you can't mention a single vendor. I just want to know what the story is for the business, and that's it. You do the whole 20 minutes on the business. And he said it helped, it helped him out. But I think to me, that brought out the story. And pretty much it's nice seeing that both you and, and the previous presentation, it was all similar stuff. So it obviously shows that we're saying similar things in different ways. So it must be on the right track. Cool. Thank you very much for that. And any other questions for Yves?
And I think Rebecca is still there as well.
For a few more minutes,
yeah. And Rebecca, yeah. Cool. If not, I'm just going to go through a mind map. Oh, hang on. We've got a question. Hang on. What was that? Was that question, Graham? Oh, that's cool. There was one up before I start talking about my mind maps. Oh, okay. Here we are. Typically, Graham sees 99.9%, but how do you know if it will work? What if there's multiple site failures per year and each one takes 8 hours to recover from? You can't predict the number of failures, so how do you fit that into an SLA? That's a good question. What do you think, guys?
So, first thing I would say is I would be curious as to what is the scope, right? Because if it's multiple sites, is it the same site failing repeatedly? Or is it, like, for example, 10 sites each failing once in the course of a year? Because at that point, depending on how the SLA is worded, that SLA at 99.9%, for example, may apply to each site individually. And if each site only fails once, then theoretically, you may not be violating that SLA, right? And that is me absolutely trying to squeeze between the lines. But with that, if you've got two choices, right? You either push back on the SLA and you need to get it way relaxed, or that should be motivation and ideally justification for budget to, pardon my French, unfuck your infrastructure so that you're not experiencing that amount of failures, right? Because at a certain point, that's unacceptable. If you're going, hey, our sites fail multiple times a year. Each time it takes 8 hours to recover from. We have no idea when it's going to fail or how many times it's going to fail in a year. At that point, if you're not able to relax the SLA, which would really, my opinion, be plan B, plan A would be, how do you fix that infrastructure? Right.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point. Fixing the infrastructure. Another scenario which I have heard is, and that again is questionable, and that's the point, is what I tend to have or try to get people to is to have different SLAs between the different failure levels. So declare levels like, okay, there is a total disaster, which means we lose a complete data center and potentially some data. There is the loss of a specific application, the loss of a specific part of the infrastructure, and then considering them having different SLAs for that. Because a lot of companies don't really expect full site recoveries in a specific time window. And very often these 99.9 or 99.99% availabilities in the SLAs are not necessarily covering complete data centers. They are very often covering specific applications. And then I need to come up with a better plan on how to protect that application if I have continuous site failures. If they are for the complete data centers, and if I have continuous data failures, then I need to look at my infrastructure. What I also have seen is people actually write in the SLAs that in case of a declared disaster, after the disaster, we start the counter back at 100%. That can be a valid point if that's how the SLA is written.
So I think that was like a really, really important point that Yves made, and I want to make sure that everybody heard that. So it depends on what the SLA covers, right? So the main thing that he was stressing there was it tends to specifically cover the application. And I think, and I mean this as no offense to anyone in here, because I've also been in the same position. We tend to focus way too much on the underlying infrastructure. And the reality is the underlying infrastructure does not matter. It is a consumable endpoint, right, for me to get my resources. What matters at the end of the day is the application that my users are accessing. So as long as the application is up, you could have pretty much your entire infrastructure fail, and it doesn't matter because the users can still access the application, right? So if the SLA is written specifically towards that application, then, you need to figure out a way to make the infrastructure not violate your application SLA.
And that comes back to business requirements. The business, and that is something we see in all the fields at the moment, is very often people focus too much on, hey, and I can use this and that to actually protect the infrastructure. It's like, what's the business requirement? I lately had a design where someone was trying to argue a completely load spread VRA implementation across multiple sites. And then I looked through the SLA and said, it's like, that SLA does not require anything like what you asked for. And he said, like, but yeah, that big consulting firm said we need it that way. And I said, it's like, your SLA allows you for more than 1 day downtime. You can basically easily back up everything. You are not even depending for day-to-day operations. It's your VRA piece is not meaning your SAP is running or not. You have a high SLA for your SAP, which needs to run, but that doesn't mean you need to redeploy your SAP every 5 minutes. And that's coming back to the whole point. What's the business requirement? What does the business user care about? The business user cares about, if we are talking about a booking portal, if the booking portal is reachable. He doesn't care which server it runs on, whether it's data center A, B, C, or D. It's just the application which needs to be available.
Yeah, perfect. I think that's what it is, isn't it? I think it all comes down to, do they care? And frankly, and I know it sounds really bad for people who love infrastructure, they don't. They only care if I only care if my app's working. So I only care if Google Mail gives me my email. I don't care. I don't want it on my iPad now, but I will care if it goes offline, or I will care if it's been hacked. But there are other things to talk about in future ones, I'm sure. Cool. Thank you, guys. I've got a quick summary thing. So I'm not going to do a presentation myself. I'd leave it to the guests, but I've got a little bit around some mind maps to try and draw it all together. And I try and put myself in the position of someone who's actually watching this presentation going, I'm kind of interested, not sure if I'll do the VCDX, might do the VCDX, have no idea what the VCDX is, but I've got to write a design for next week and I'm the IT guy. And where do I start? So we've got some really good points, but how do you build it together and do it for documentation? So I've taken this directly out. All the little marks are the company name, but it's not really meant to be read. It's meant just to talk about things. It's every single step or every single component. So a lot of people think it's just the app, and I agree. But now let's turn it on its side. Yes, it's about the app, but what supports the app? So I think Eve mentioned a very good point when you've got API endpoints. Now everyone's becoming software defined. And we're going to solve it all. We're going to automate the world. But what if the API goes offline? What if the control plane to the API goes offline? Those kinds of concepts. And I think going back to the risk mitigation, I think risk management, and I did a quick walkthrough of that, how to bring it back together and how to validate you're actually going to do a good job on the DR. Do you have each risk associated with it? Do you have a risk that says someone is actually going to misconfigure this new piece of technology that's always brilliant? So VMware, any vendor, are going to turn around and say that this new feature is going to solve a problem. What if I misconfigure that against what Eves has said is the best way to design it? What if I accidentally change that? What if something impacts that? How do I monitor it, and how do I show that I can actually see it happen and then do something about it? I think it all brings it back. So risk isn't the risk management section of a design. I think for me is the most important one. It brings back all the features and goes back to the SLA. And I think for each section of the platform, consider it. So I know that if I have a platform which is API driven, the vCenter is important, the NSX manager is important, those kinds of access. But my cloud management platform, maybe that's what the SLA is there. The SLA is the cloud management platform must be able to make change. So they must be able to deploy VMs. That's a recent SLA I've had. If they can't log on and deploy their app, we're out. That's one piece of the SLA. And how do you show that you can bring that back in a controlled fashion? I think that's one thought about it. But then on a mind map, I think the biggest point is no one's going to give you an RPO and RTO. I think if I actually speak to people in the business, they don't know what it means. Even, IT people for several years who don't do design might not know what RPO and RTO is. And is it infrastructure-based? Is it workload-based? How much data loss can they have? And how much time to bring it back? And I think one thing that was kind of interesting is who presses the button. So I had a project for a well-known retailer recently, in the UK, and we were designing something, and then someone came up to me and said, "Hang on a minute, I don't want it to automatically restart VMs. I don't like that. Hang on a minute, that's not what I want. I want a big red button to press it." But then the impact of who's going to press that button, and then I think Eve said earlier, if I've got 2 data centers and I've got a failure, who is actually going to be brave enough to press that button? Are you going to break fix on site A, flip a couple of apps across, keep them going, and then bring it back? Or are you going to risk failing everything over and multiple impact to all your apps? Yeah, sometimes it is a paper exercise, and sometimes you're actually going to go through with it. So the active decision where the software is going to automatically do it for us and we take the hit, or it's the whole world ends if one app fails and we have controlled data, we have risk mitigation, and we have recovery plans associated with it. 2 different major concepts. I think that's a very big question to ask the person. Do you want a big red button? If you do, it changes the design concept completely. How do you operationalize who presses that button, why, when, and how? And who's the person pressing the button? What's their skill set? I think those kinds of things. Also, shared fate. I think shared fate's another concept. If your application keeps failing, I want to stretch layer 2 because I don't want to change the IP address because it makes my life easier. Will make network people cry. If you've got a single broadcast domain between 2 sites, you have got potential risks associated with that broadcast domain. And can you justify and mitigate against them? I know that's what I found in various designs. How do I mitigate against that? How do I stop a potential loop hitting both sides? How does that happen? Those kinds of things. And I think testing, auditing, those kinds of concepts. And then so that's from a conceptual point of view. This is what I'm defining. These are the types of questions. Notice I've got one section on governance. Is it going to automatically fail over? Yeah. Every time a layer 2 VLAN is stretched, a unicorn dies. Yes. But a new rainbow appears, apparently. Probably next to a public cloud and a vendor, I'm sure. But I think press the button or automatic. Automatic, the holy grail, restarting stretched clusters, I think are brilliant. But if you can have a split brain scenario, you have application consistency between them, those kinds of things, there is potential risk associated with them. And will the business take the risk? So I always try to think SLA plus risk.
So Paul, when you talk about automatic, you covered if you have a layer 2 or a stretched scenario. Have you seen a lot of companies really doing automatic in a not stretched fashion, where maybe I have one data center in the UK, one in the US? Would you see that a valid option to do that automatic in such a scenario?
I think we've got a similar project at the moment at a financial institution, and it's a 2-year project. We're away from actually implementing it, but I think aspirationally they want to be able to do that. In the end, I don't think they will. They're not going to. I don't know how unless you're going to have a cloud native app which can be rebuilt and have the consistency to put their name brand on it on a recovery point, which is automatic. That's the risk. When it goes live again in the other site, if it's automatic, how do they know it's consistent? And that's the key with their vendor name on it. I think with their brand, that's one concern. I think no one's going to press it. No one wants to do it.
If it's cloud native, I think that's a valid option. If the application is built from the bottom up with that in mind, which if we look at services like Google and Facebook, they can recover from such scenarios, at least to a certain degree. but that's built in.
That's not a financial that's not a financial application that's been sitting there as a big app for years, though. I think
Financial
that's the problem.
Is a bit different, because if you look at something like a Facebook or a Google, if you have multiple records being inconsistent in multiple different locations, you can worry about that later. If the balance of a bank account is actually in violation, you have a bigger problem. And if we look back at 9/11, actually you need to talk to Visa. They saw people trying to manipulate bank accounts minutes afterwards, if you look through their papers. And that's an interesting story, because one of their main data centers was actually in one part of the towers. So these scenarios is something why, especially when you talk about finance or governmental and certain other systems, there are certain systems where you can't just actually do that automatically, because the impact of it is just too dramatic, and you will potentially never resync systems afterwards. And that's where it comes to.
That's a big one. Yeah.
Is the application ready for automatic failover?
And I think a lot of people in the field, we read, we look at podcasts, we go to various other places, we go to conferences, and we're always talking about the latest, greatest public cloud-based application. In the real world, you don't see that. I have, in my current project, I have over 200 applications to move from one data center into a multi-data center. That's the project I'm working on. And
how many of them run still on Windows NT or Windows 2003?
Quite a few, quite a few. And they're not moving them. They're not replatforming them. It takes too much money to do at the moment.
Yeah, and that's the typical reason.
Yeah. Don't count out all the people who are still using mainframes.
Exactly. That is true. And the scary thing is, in some places and in some areas, the mainframes are going back. But from an architectural point of view, it doesn't change the thoughts, which is good. I think if you crack the architecture, it doesn't matter what the technology is. I think you've got the same principles. But
mainframe has many valid points. It's a different approach to a different problem. And it can actually do things which we can't do on a standard x86 platform, but therefore there are also a lot of things you can't do on it the way we can do it on x86.
Exactly, that is true. There's a lot of things you can do. Yeah. So I think it's a deep subject. I think we've touched on pretty much a lot of the areas. I think some of the things where they've in some companies that I've worked at, they've had applications that are driven by the business, and they're trying to shoehorn designs that are highly available and can be recovered quickly across links that have got different service providers that are not going to be renewed for several years, and that actually restricts the design. So I think you've got latency, capacity around that, which are kind of big decision points. Have I got the ability to recover? If I've got site A and site B and I fail over to site B, how do I actually manage the capacity ongoing, justify it, and then fail back if I've been running in there for a good long time? How do I get the consistency back? I'm going back to consistency on backup. If I replicate all my data, how do I know it's consistent? How do I test that? If it's a stretched cluster, for example, if something's active and automatic, how do I test my failover? How do I get comfort it's going to work? What if I do if I press that button? Those things are always hard to justify if you're an architect and you say, I'm putting, once it goes live, it goes live. Or do I want to test in a bubble and prove it? And then who's going to test it? So I think
why we have a test environment. And
exactly.
The test environment should be exactly
However,
the way
how many
the
people work in an environment where test is consistent?
Oh no, we have one. It's called production.
That's it. Exactly. That's exactly what I've got. We've got non-prod. Yeah, but it's non-prod. It doesn't matter. But that's where your source control lives, and it all goes wrong. And how many non-prod is the same as prod? Exactly. And that's one good thing. Let's automate it. How do you build it? Could you walk me through it? I do a little bit, and this bloke does a little bit, and this bloke does a little bit. So no one actually knows how to build it from end to end. No. so we can't automate it. I think the software's there, the vendors are there, but I think there's a good thing for us on the call and for all architects. I think there's definitely a job for us going forward to educate business people. Yeah, I think we can definitely educate people as we go along and take them along for a journey. I think that's one thing I think is good. That's the bit that I enjoy, is educating people along the way. And then I learn about new technology, but it is bringing out that it's not the latest, greatest product. It's how it's built together from the business perspective. But anyway, just as a quick review of this, as I know we're getting close to time. Conceptually, logical, physical. So conceptually, I go out and gather my requirements. I find out what this big vision is, how much data loss they can have, how much time they can bring it back. Is it API driven? What do they need bringing back? Is it just the app? Is there any constraints around it? Do they need a big red button? Who's going to press the button? What risk around it? And then what sort of testing and frequency and auditing is required? So they're the couple of the big. This shapes my design. If I'm doing a whiteboard scenario, yeah, that would be some of the key things. So if people are doing the VCDX soon, these are the things I'll be asking straight away. Yeah, straight away. How many sites have you got? How much time can you avoid data loss? And going business, they will answer. And I think anybody in the real world will know these kinds of things. Shared fate's a big one to be able to get rid of. It's going to cost money, but having shared fate is going to be hard to root cause analysis. And I think there's a really good, if you're interested in that, there's a really, really good podcast by Datanauts and Chris Waugh, who's done a shared fate discussion. I think that I found that very, very useful when I was studying about the kinds of things. He gave some really good tips there. Then bringing that into a logical design, I'm going to start talking about decisions. I'm going to say all things may not have shared fate, and how am I going to mitigate that? Yeah. What are the key dependencies? So if I draw out my application, if I draw out it from a point of view, what are the application dependencies? If I say if it was NSX, if I lose the control VM, I lose the ability to change networks. So that means I lose the ability to have updates on my route redistribution on the forwarding plane. So it impacts me there. What's the mitigation against that? And if I have shared fate, how do I do that? That's going to impact my design decisions on the left-hand side of here when I go into onto my physical decisions. So really looking at the data center layers that I did earlier, my M, V, C, and S, every single layer has to be considered if it impacts the app or anything that the SLA is scoped on. Okay, so that's kind of how I think about it. And then I picked a few things around about VMware, which could be, is it consistent? How am I going to back this up and how long is it going to be? So for example, we were moving from NetApp to something else, but we work in a financial and need to have 7 years backup. How are you going to recover from a NetApp backup 6.5 years ago if you've now got rid of NetApp and gone somewhere else? That kind of thing. Yeah, so those kinds of thoughts as we go through. Hopefully that's useful. I'm not going to go through them all. It's just really bringing all together what Yves and Rebecca have said today. So thank you very much for attending. Thank you very much to the guys who put outstanding effort into their slides and their conversations. I think it was a pretty good deep dive into DR. I think we've got a few more coming. I'm going to do this once a month. This has been recorded, so I'll edit some bits out, make it shorter, and then put it on YouTube. We're going to talk about soft skills for the architect. I think Yves mentioned some really good things about how do you present things. Yeah, I think that's really cool. And some acts of security design thoughts. I think how do you make things more secure? I'm going through one at the moment where we've got an existing platform. We've got to make it secure for a certain payment system. And that's going to be quite interesting on how we retrofit it, which is quite interesting. I think that's quite a good one. And then how deep do you go in multi-skills if you're an architect? How deep do you go into it, or do you need to know little bits of everything else? So there are a couple of thoughts I was thinking about. But anyway, that's all from me. And I thank you again to my co-presenters, and hopefully I'll see you all at VMworld. So I'll be I'll be along to both of them this year. I'm kind of lucky. So I'll see you then. Cheers, guys.
See you there, Paul.
Cheers, Eve. I'll see you then.